Hello, welcome to our study of the Kangyur Rinpoche, the Treasury of Precious Qualities by the Omniscient Jigme Lingpa, with commentary by Kangyur Rinpoche, Longchen Yeshe Dorje. Just to begin with, just to have a sound check, is the sound all right? Can you hear me? Good. Okay, great. So we are presently looking at the foundation for the greatness of spirit of the Mahayana. We're looking at the so-called four immeasurables, four boundless, and thus far we've looked at what they are, and now we'll look a little bit at how to properly understand them to, you could say, avoid sidetracks with regards to this. So before we begin, we'll begin with invoking the wisdom body of Omniscient Jigme Lingpa, the source and love of compassion for all beings, who knows all that is knowable, emanation of Longchenpa, heir to a treasury of mind tamas, sky-like yogin of the vast expanse of luminosity. Jigme Lingpa, at your feet we pray. So let's look at the root text. So we've talked about essentially love, compassion, joy, and impartiality. And we've defined what they are. Now, problem is, all of these could possibly be hijacked, or we could say they could be owned by the narrowness of our ignorance, ego, and that's where Omniscient Jigme Lingpa then says, but love that is desire, compassion that is greed, proud inflated joy, and ignorance indifference, these are not the path to freedom, but resemble Brahma's four abidings. Stained with partiality and clinging, they should be abandoned. So Kangyur Rinpoche then, commenting on this, he says, by contrast, the loving attitude of wishing happiness for one's friends and relatives out of attachment, the kind of compassion that, for instance, spares animals from toil only out of miserliness, the conceited exhilaration that comes from being more prosperous than others, and the formless, mindless indifference of wishing neither to help nor harm, these have nothing to do with the authentic path of liberation. These are more akin to the four so-called Brahma Viharas, the four attitudes that provoke rebirth in the form and formless realms. So we can kind of see that. I mean, everywhere in our culture, we're big on love. There's a general sense that love is the most precious sentiment that we could have, and indeed it is, because it's a sentiment that embraces other. But if it's still, you could say, it still comes with strings attached. The way that we love others very often, and we even within our own discourse and culture, we're very often, perhaps we could even say refreshingly cynical about love. And we're in no way diminishing the value of love, but we need to recognize that it comes as a two-edged sword. It can be something that is really caring for others, and that's what we'd like to think that our love is. But then also it could be a love that has strings attached, that comes with expectations. Then we have compassion that might have an agenda also. We might be kind to, in this case, we're talking about animals, animals that work for us. But then again, it might just be out of miserliness. We might simply be gentle on the animals because it's in our interest in one way or another. And then there's joy, but if it's joy that just comes on one hand from just things coming our way, or even that it's comparing ourselves to others, and this is also obviously a toxic kind of joy that essentially feeds our self-centering. And then there's the just what we often actually, this is very often comes up in the notion of equanimity. And that very often we think, oh, well, equanimity, that's just some sort of like, also within the notion of detachment. You know, sometimes people will say, oh, this detachment of the Buddhists, that's just horrible because that means you don't care about anybody. And that's not what we're talking about. And that's exactly what Kangyur Rinpoche says. That what we mean with equanimity here, or detachment for that matter, is not about just being indifferent, but it's very much about extending it beyond just those that we ordinarily think about in terms of attachment. And as such, including also those to whom we don't have attachment, those that we dislike. And that's where we talk about those that are not just those that are close to us, but also those that are not close to us, or those to whom we are indifferent, those that we dislike. Equanimity is very often, Paltram Rinpoche compares it to the feast of a sage. When a sage throws a party, everybody's invited. There's no sort of, well, let's take those people, but not those, and so on. So that's where the impartiality is the qualities, the awake qualities of love and compassion and joy that are extended equally to all beings. Now, if we don't have that, if we don't have that kind of equanimity, and particularly what we talk about here, as we saw before, why we refer to them as the four boundless, or the four immeasurables, or the four boundless attitudes. These are boundless because the scope, those that we include, are all sentient beings. Now we talk about Brahma, and we'll see here the explanation here. The Brahma who has these qualities, but again, they're not necessarily the cause of enlightenment. So here it says, the Tibetan is Tsangbe Neshi, and the four divine abidings or attitudes in which the great Brahma is said eternally to dwell. Ostensibly, they are the same as the four boundless attitudes just described, namely love, compassion, joy, and impartiality, but with the crucial difference that they are oriented towards the subject rather than the object. This gives rise to unwarranted distinctions made between beings according to one's own point of view rather than theirs. Thus, the tendency is to love what is close and pleasing to oneself, to be compassionate, but in a self-interested way, and so on. So this is essentially the kind of these four sentiments as they're experienced by someone who has, you know, beyond any doubt, a great mind that loves and is compassionate and so forth, but still not in a boundless way. So that's where there's a distinction between what we call the four Brahma Viharas and then the four boundless. So here here we are essentially talking about the four Brahma Viharas in terms of how Brahma dwells. There's no mentioning of the other Buddhist schools that might define this in their own particular way. So, so then 9, let me just finish here actually. Since they approach their objects with partiality and bias, and since their character is one of clinging, they are a distortion of the four boundless attitudes of the Mahayana and should be utterly discarded. So here we're essentially cultivating the four boundless as the preliminaries for bodhicitta. And we'll also see they actually possess both the aspects of wisdom and compassion. So here Jigme Lingpa says, but when they are connected with the path that leads to peace, these practices encompass everything that lives, who, though without intrinsic being, nonetheless appear. These trainings, when they gain in strength, become the cause of the two bodhicittas. Therefore, they are called the four extraordinary and boundless attitudes. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, in the context of the Mahayana path leading to peace, the non-abiding nirvana beyond the two extremes, this is awakening. And when we talk about the non-abiding nirvana, this stands in opposition to the nirodha or the gokpa, the cessation in which we actually abide. That's the problem with and in the Mahayana, we identify this tendency towards just wishing personal peace, personal nirvana, essentially how the Mahayana defined the arhat, the state of the arhat. And that is understood as having some reference point. When we talk about the non-abiding nirvana beyond the two extremes, that's where this refers to enlightenment as not being an abiding condition, but full enlightenment. That's what we mean with non-abiding nirvana. So sometimes nirvana can be understood as the small nirvana of just personal peace, but also we can refer to nirvana in terms of that which does not have reference point, and which is then the non-abiding nirvana. Beyond the two extremes, again, the extremes of fixating on phenomena as having true existence or having or non-existence. So that's where we talk about eternalism and nihilism. And this nirvana does not abide in any of these. It's not understood in some way that can be understood as absolute in terms of something that we hold on to, or in terms of some sort of naught or void in which there is just, you could say, extinction. So that's where that kind of nirvana is beyond enlightenment. The non-abiding nirvana is beyond these notions of some absolute, beyond any kind of what we call then extremes, conceptual positions. So in the context of the Mahayana, the focus of the four boundless attitudes is an entire aggregate of beings and is completely without bias. So here the four boundless, they're directed towards all sentient beings. Moreover, although such beings, and for that matter, the four attitudes themselves, and that refers to the scope or the object of these attitudes, all sentient beings, and the subject, the attitudes themselves. These are all manifest phenomena, again, on the basis of causes and conditions. They are effective within our relative experience because they are dependent arisen phenomena, and for that reason, these manifest phenomena, they're without inherent existence, being primordially beyond all conceptual construction. So that's where we would say their nature, by their very nature, they are, you could say, absolute or ultimate nature is beyond anything that we can fixate on. So let's see here. It says, they are beyond the four ontological extremes. It cannot be cannot be said that they exist, and here we mean ultimately, that they do not exist. Also there we refer to the ultimately, that they both exist and do not exist ultimately, and that they neither exist nor do not exist ultimately. So whenever we have these kind of this refutation of what we call the four ontological extremes, which is what the middle way is all about, we're just talking about the ultimate nature of these phenomena, in this case, the four boundless and so forth. So that's where they are ultimately, primordially, without any reality. But that doesn't mean that they don't function at the relative level. So through repeated training, the four boundless attitudes in which both skillful means and wisdom are combined will strengthen and eventually give rise to relative and absolute bodhicitta. And that means that when we understand how the object, sentient beings, and the subject that generates these four boundless are beyond any conceptual construction, when we keep that in mind, then the cultivation of these four boundless attitudes, where we then, on the basis of one, cultivating these sentiments, two, seeing how they ultimately have no reality, that constitutes what we call both skillful means and wisdom. And when we have that, then the practice of these four boundless attitudes becomes stronger in us. We become stronger, more powerful in terms of the path. We have a great love that extends beyond our ordinary love, and yet also we know its emptiness nature. Similarly with compassion, joy, and impartiality. And on the basis of that, then we say, these training in these four boundless eventually gives rise to relative and absolute bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta, which has as its scope all sentient beings, and absolute bodhicitta, which is freedom from any reference point. So, considering how they are effective in terms of what is so important, namely the bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, they are referred to as extraordinary. They are endowed with a skill and wisdom that are not found among the Shravakas, Pratyekya Buddhas, and those who follow worldly paths, essentially those that we refer to as the Hinayana. And what we refer to then also as ordinary worldly paths, those that are not interested in awakening or even the spiritual path. So there we have it. Now, how to meditate on the four boundless attitudes. So 10 and 11, Jigme Lingpa writes, they may be meditated on in sequence or in order, focused on the things with which they are generated easily. Yet if meditation upon love inflames desire, attention should be given to impartiality, where beings are not seen as close or distant. And if the mind becomes indifferent and dull, this is stopped by switching to compassion and the cause of fruit and pain. If then compassion sinks towards discouragement, by focusing on joy, depression is dispelled. But if through joy the mind is wild and scattered, we should meditate on love and so forth, mixing thus the order. So we cultivate these on the basis of reflecting on the value of meditating on joy. And also we have particular methods in terms of for example, love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. These four, they're cultivated on the basis of particular reflections that we keep. For example, the fact that sentient beings who have cared so much for us, the fact that they might have happiness, could give us joy. Just like if we're parents that see that our children are happy, or somebody that we really care about, we know have really earned having a good time. We feel joy. We're not jealous. So that's where in the meditation, there are sentiments that we cultivate in order to make these rise. So they become real sentiments within us. But we also need to be careful that, for example, like it says here, if we meditate upon love, caring, or wishing somebody be happy, that all of a sudden we begin to have focus and a reference point in terms of someone or something and a particular attachment, and that's where it then becomes desire. So that's where, to remedy that, we have the meditation of impartiality. And similarly also with the other three, there are particular antidotes. So Kangyur Rinpoche will explain this. So the four boundless attitudes, and actually something is said about these. Oh yeah, this is a little bit technical, but there we have it. We shouldn't be scared, and we probably, if we get used to these, they won't be that scary or seem excessively technical. There are four conditions for the appearance of the four boundless attitude. The causal condition, namely the Tathagata. We have naturally the disposition that can give rise to these four. The dominant condition, namely the spiritual friend who teaches the four boundless attitudes, there we have it. Jigme Lingpa presently is exposing us to the four boundless, the idea of that. The objective condition, which is the object of the meditator's focus, meaning sentient beings, and the immediately preceding condition, namely the knowledge of the benefits of this meditation and the defects of the opposite. So that's where we are motivated by the value of this and understanding the shortcomings of not meditating on these four boundless. So these four boundless attitudes may be meditated upon either in the direct order described here or in any sequence, as when the meditation on impartiality is taken first. To begin, this is something that we see probably in other traditions as well, but I'm familiar with this from the Longchen Nyingtik, and in general, the Nyingma approach to the four boundless very often stresses this, where they say, in our tradition, we begin with impartiality. So that's where impartiality is understood as the place where these sentiments don't fall into the flawed position of love being attachment to some, and similarly also compassion being an agenda, joy being wound up with a self-centered interest, and so on. If we have impartiality from the very start, it does become something much more vast. So that's where then Kangyur Rinpoche says, to begin with, one should get used to the practice by focusing on objects towards whom these attitudes may be entertained easily. So that's where, if we don't have love, if there's not a lot of love happening, then we could begin to generate, just to become acquainted what love feels like by simply just thinking of somebody we actually do care for. However, Kangyur Rinpoche then says, in order to counteract attachment, should it arise while meditating in a fixed order, the sequence of meditation should be changed. It may happen, for instance, that in the course of sustained meditation on love and cherishing, the practice itself produces attachment. If this happens, the meditation on impartiality, which is free from bias towards those who are close and opposed to those who are distant, will remove such attachment. On the other hand, if during the meditation on impartiality, the mind becomes simply adult and neutral and loses its benevolent impulse, then by shifting to the meditation on compassion and reflecting on how beings sow and reap the crop of suffering, this worthless kind of impartiality will be averted. And here again, we're talking about this sort of jaded quality of just being impartial, like, oh yeah, who cares? That sort of cold-hearted indifference, that's not partiality. And if that happens when we're meditating on partiality, like the love and the compassion wears thin, that's where we then need to shift to something that remedies that. And that's where the meditation on compassion comes from, this understanding of how beings, despite wanting suffering, engaging ignorantly in the causes of suffering effectively, they suffer. And as it says here, they sow and reap the crop of suffering. And they do so on the basis of their own actions. So that's where compassion should be generated. So that's where this, like Kangyur Rinpoche says, this worthless kind of impartiality will be avoided. This worthless kind of equanimity where we just basically are indifferent to the suffering or the joys of others. And again, if while meditating on compassion and reflecting on the immense suffering that beings experience, the mind becomes excessively downcast and depressed, by turning to the meditation on sympathetic joy and focusing on the happiness and prosperity of beings, it is possible to avoid discouragement. So that's where, again, we might meditate on the suffering of sentient beings and then become overwhelmed. And that's where we should be joyful when sentient beings are happy, and understand that on the basis of some actions, then sentient beings will experience joy, and just being happy for sentient beings. So that's where we don't necessarily become depressed by the meditation on compassion. Then Kangyur Rinpoche writes, finally, if meditation on joy leads to overexcitement and distraction of the mind, one should begin to meditate on love, and so on. So we might be sympathetic to those that are happy, but then again, we might be we might get overly distracted by just observing how sentient beings are having a jolly good time. We might be meditating on compassion, and then we get all depressed, and then we realize there are beings happy, having a wonderful time. And then pondering them, we might just be a little bit overwhelmed with all that sort of the excitement around the joy that sentient beings. Some sentient beings are having a very nice time, and we should be happy for them. But we also should understand the illusory nature of this. And that's where we should come from, a place of genuine caring for these sentient beings, not either envious or overexcited by watching their overexcitement. Okay. Benefits of this meditation. Anyway, I hope everybody understands what we're talking about here is that these qualities, they are generated. They're not just we say, oh, I don't have any compassion, I don't have any sympathetic joy, whatever. We don't say like that. That's just simply not just in the Buddhist teaching. We know that everything comes on the basis of causes and conditions. So we generate this on the basis of being proactive in terms of contemplating. So this is where we work with the mind. And this again, this is where we can't refer to this as philosophy because it's working with something that we can feel and work with. Just like we can, we can shape our garden. We can design our garden, we can be out there, we can weed, we can sow, we can cultivate and tend to. All of that is clearly something that where the garden only flourishes if we're proactive. So similarly, also when we're talking about this, has nothing to do with philosophy. This is all about something to do with what we very tangibly can do with our mind. The benefits of this meditation. So here, Jigme Lingpa says in verse 12 and 13, by meditating in this way, we will, as ripened fruit, gain high rebirth among desire realm gods or humankind, and then enlightenment itself. According to effects resembling their causes, we will actively continue in this practice and experience happiness untroubled by adversity. Through the conditioning effect, we will be happy in a pleasant dwelling place, and through the increasing fruit, the strength of these four attitudes will prosper, and related to the twofold goal, will every virtuous quality be gained. So this is where there's the effects of this. We're talking about what will be the effects, and we'll look at this. We talk about four kinds of effects, just like we also talked about various kinds of conditions. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, training in the four boundless attitude gives rise to four results. One, the fully ripened karmic result will be rebirth in the higher realms of samsara with the perfect form of a human being or a god of the desire realm. This is important again. This counters the idea of thrownness, that we're just thrown into any particular existence and it's not fair. The particular experience that we have, our particular situation, has come about as the fully ripened karmic result of our previous actions. So here we're looking at the karmic results of meditating on these four boundless attitudes. So that's the fully ripened karmic result. With the support of such a body, it will be possible to complete the two accumulations and achieve ultimate excellence, the grounds of the twin paths of learning and no more learning. So that's where we say it. We talk about the path in terms of its further result, which will be the completion of the two accumulations, merit and wisdom, and the ultimate excellence, the highest form, and we're just talking about essentially enlightenment, where we again have the two, on the basis of the two accumulations, we have the perfection of the path of learning and the path of no more learning. The accumulation of merit bringing about the perfection of the path of learning, and the accumulation of wisdom bringing about the path of no more learning. With regards to the two effects, similar to the cause, actively, action similar to cause, one will continue. So this is where we continue according to the pattern that we put down. One will continue to meditate on the four boundless attitude in all one's subsequent lives, and experientially experience similar to the cause. One will attain perfect happiness free from the four unfavorable factors of malevolence, cruelty, jealous, and craving, taken together with anger. So that's where we're looking at actions that we are continue doing, patterns of action, but also patterns of experience. So that's the second. And then, sorry, as for the conditioning environmental effect, the practice of love will result in the experience of congenial places with pleasant company and amenities. That's where we can again look. Some of us will have been reborn in a particular situation where we had congenial circumstances, some didn't. And that's again where we're talking about how it's the mind that generates our reality. Again, we have been brought up to believe that we are shaped by the particular circumstances we find ourselves in, whether it's parents or genetics or whatever, or environment. But here we're talking about it the other way around. We can't blame our parents or whatever situations, traumas, and so on as being out there, because it's we ourselves that generate this experience. And again, coming back to the primacy of mind, we understand how in the conditioning environmental effect, this is something that comes about on the basis of our mind. And in this case, the practice of love that will this will result in us having particular rebirths which are pleasant, and in the course of our lives, then we'll have pleasant company, we'll have what we need. Through compassion, one will find fortunate conditions of both body and mind. Because of sympathetic joy, the environment will be adorned with medicinal trees and plants and will be a pleasure to live in. Through impartiality, one will find oneself in a country where the people are friendly and live in harmony. 4. Due to the proliferating effect, how this then, you say, continues, the ripple effect, one's practice of the 4 boundless altitudes will gain in strength, and every excellent quality related to the twofold paths, one's own and others' benefit, will be gained. So that's where, on one hand, the practice itself will gradually augment, and also the qualities. There we talk about twofold aim. The one's own and others' benefit will be gained. Yeah. Okay, let's just see. I've had another one of these days where I've been presenting some material for. I did a course, this workshop that ran from 10 to 4, and sometimes I'm a little bit tired after that. So as we've seen before, I might just end the class a little bit early. How wisdom and action are connected. Basically, when there is wisdom, our action becomes much better. So that's where very often when we have wisdom, then our actions they're much more compassionate, because they're not caught up in a belief of ourselves, and they're also not limited by our perception of the others. And that's where our actions become much more, you could say, appropriate. They become much more, you could say, helpful in terms of benefiting others. So wisdom is essential for everything. And we can see our actions are very different when we come from a place of wisdom rather than habitual patterns or impulses. Does meditation on the 4 boundless help one with bipolar? Undoubtedly, this helps with everything. Problem is sometimes when we have, you could say, a little bit of imbalance, then it's difficult for us to understand and apply some of these. That's why we talk about the precious human rebirth, in which unfavorable conditions are absent, and we have favorable conditions in terms of what we can do. And that's where we talk about having the faculties to practice the Dharma. And these can be both in terms of, you could say, physical faculties, but also in terms of psychological faculties. So that's where sometimes our psychological disposition might not be there, where we can actually truly understand the teaching and where we can, apply them. On the other hand, I would like to say, as far as you could say the label bipolar goes, we should be a little bit wary of how within our contemporary culture, we increasingly do what we call pathologize. We label, you could say, psychological states that might be challenging as being actual disease, and that's where they become solidified. It's interesting to see how there is a continual, gradual, there's more and more pathologization taking place. There's more and more labeling, you could say, psychological challenges that if we have some degree of insight and some degree of determination, we needn't succumb to some idea that, well, I have this particular diagnosis. I've been diagnosed as bipolar. Or we think of others, oh yeah, that person is diagnosed as bipolar. Then there's a sort of a disempowered perspective. On the other hand, it can be very helpful for persons who really are profoundly imbalanced to have a diagnosis in which there's then some, you could say, sympathy, and becomes a basis for some compassion towards oneself or towards those that have that. So it's complex, but I would like to say that we should be a little bit wary of sometimes these labels that we have with psychological states. So that's where you know, to engage in the methods of Buddhism, we'd really want to, first of all, have trust in the guide, the Buddha, trust in the Buddha's teaching, and trust in the community of those that are practicing this. So that's why we talk about taking refuge in the three jewels as the foundations for the Buddhist path. Of course, there are some aspects of Buddhism that we can sort of extract and apply to others, and we shouldn't necessarily just be partial to people who are only Buddhist, but it's very often that for us to really appreciate the profundity of these methods, there has to be this, you could say, enthusiasm, this joy that also, you could say, comes from a place of a deep respect and awe of the brilliance of the Buddha's teachings, or the brilliance of our teacher, or the Dharma. Okay, someone says, thank you. For me, this has clarified very well relative and absolute bodhicitta relation. Okay, good. I'm glad if it's helpful. And someone agrees with me with regards to the modern tendency to pathologize psychological states. Yes, we have some challenges there. Okay. All right. So so if I may, hope I may, how do you say, pardon myself and end a little bit early. Class, you're dismissed. You have longer time in the playground. So I hope this is a good thing. Let's see here. Here, you should use the time to travel a bit in what looks like Tuscany. Okay. Anyway, we'll dedicate, let's see here, dedication. Yeah. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. So, thank you.